Hello, my name is David Hawkins, and I'll be taking you through today's presentation. We'll be covering 5 ways to mature your third-party risk management program. As a consulting engineer here at BitSight, I've helped hundreds of companies mature their program or build new programs from scratch using these tips. I'll get into these tips shortly, but first, I intend to cover a couple of background items that'll help inform these tips. So first, digital transformation is happening for organizations across the globe. And with this, we're seeing attack vectors that hit organizations at the heart of their digital supply chains. SolarWinds, Kaseya, and ransomware attacks continue to make headline news. This means that third-party cyber risk management is becoming a must-have business requirement. In recognition of the importance of cybersecurity, BitSight has partnered with Moody's to help leaders build resilience into their programs and incorporate cybersecurity intelligence into their corporate decision-making activities. We also see in cybersecurity where security attacks against a third party's vendor have major implications for your own business. As an organization's digital footprint expands, it is increasingly vulnerable to cyber threats. Cyber threats are the number 1 or number 2 risk domain cited by leaders across the globe. And that's not surprising. This timeline starts out with Target's data breach in 2013, which was a result of an attack on one of Target's third parties. We're seeing events like Hafnium, SolarWinds playing out as major supply chain incidents. And as the chain of custody for sensitive data or across critical system extends, the potential for impact does as well. So obviously, companies today are adopting vendor risk programs as a process that must be brilliantly executed in the organization. But there are a number of challenges that exist for TPRM programs today, including validating vendor assessments, coordinating a cross-functional process, having a lack of continuous monitoring, having difficulty in tiering, assessments tend to just take too long, a lack of executive reporting about all of the above, a lack of integration with other capabilities like GRC or third-party risk management programs, a lack of vendor outreach or follow-up for remediations, and finally, a lack of resources for third-party risk management tasks.
Hey, hi, Serene. It is good to have you here sharing with us some of your experiences. But specifically, what about things that you might have heard from customers about their third-party programs, their vendor risk programs? Maybe you can share some of the challenges that you have heard, and then maybe share with the audience.
Sure. Thanks, Eric, and hi, David. Very nice to hear from you. I have spoken to many prospects over the past few years. I think one of the key challenges that I've always heard customers talk about is the inability to consolidate all the vendors that they have. And it's kind of challenging to define the tiers or the criticality of the type of vendors, right? So they probably go broadly critical and not so critical. Vendors who have access to their network or vendors who are holding on to their customers' data. So that's one of the key challenges that I've always heard. The other one is also about cross-functional sharing information across different functions, whether it's the InfoSec team or the finance team or the legal team. It is difficult and challenging to communicate across the different functions. David, what about you? In your world, how does it look like?
So that whole idea of tiering, one of the things that I find organizations struggle with is, you're right. How do you determine that is that vendor appropriately rated from a criticality perspective so that you know what kind of risk it represents to the business, and then be able to figure out what am I doing with the tiers themselves. So inherent risk models that do the tiering generally giving you the guidelines you need to decide what the risk represents when a vendor is in that particular tier. But when it comes to how BitSight uses those tiers, not only are we going to use that same exact inherent risk model from your side, we're going to use that to actually set something else up that actually occurs frequently, which is how does an organization deal with continuous monitoring? And once you set up the tiers and now we know the criticality, we actually associate specific alert sets to those tiers. And by doing so, we actually make it easy for you to understand what kind of risk is occurring at the tier level, and then also be able to drill into it by vendor whenever some alert comes out. In tip 1, we're going to talk about using a common metric for cyber risk. Using a security rating helps translate complex security risk issues into business context. And by having a common metric, it is easy to communicate and understand risk. Ensure that you have a measure that is common across all vendors, ensuring that comparisons are understandable and clear. And while ratings are not going to see everything behind the firewall, much of what is used to protect what is outside the firewall is protected by the same technologies and policies that are used inside the firewall. As a result, external ratings are often very comparable to the internal company security performance. Because of this, a security rating can deliver the unique value of continuously monitoring security and risk in your vendor portfolio.
Hey, David. I've met a lot of customers. They are very busy with their security program, but I always hear from them that one of the biggest challenges, right, is really to establish the metrics for their program. What are your views, as you interact with all the global customers and maybe even folks that you have met in the US?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So typically, an organization will look at a rating as a simple way to judge, a certain posture from a cyber risk perspective on a vendor. So whatever that risk rating is a standard, easy way to look at the rating. However, this is where that tiering we just talked about in the previous conversation comes into play, because at that point, when you look at how you set up tiers, you set up criticality. So tier 1 is the most critical, tier 2 is the next most critical, and so on. And obviously most customers, they have their own names, but the same principle applies, where the most critical to the next critical. And then the rating actually determines in the risk area, how risky is that vendor in that tier. So now what you're looking at is essentially a median for the tier that says, we have 20 vendors in that tier, and the ratings that we're finding range from as high as maybe 800 all the way down to, say, 400. And somewhere in between is a median. I'm not so good at math that I can just say 800, 400, it's instantly 700, but I'm going to just say it is. So 700 might be that median. And I also may say, I personally want to make sure that organizations I work with have at least a 700 or greater. So now I've got the median and the threshold determined. And when I see somebody drop below that threshold, now I know there's something to do about that. Serene, what do you think? Any thoughts around how you've seen cyber ratings get used as a standard in an organization?
Yes and no. Interesting you mentioned 700. So just to deviate the topic a little bit, a customer in Singapore is actually using 700 as a benchmark for their own subsidiaries, almost like their third parties. Some of their JVs, they use BitSight to monitor their JVs, their so-called third parties, right? 700 is their benchmark. Anyone above 700, they basically leave them alone, right? Otherwise, then it's a consistent conversation of remediation process. How is it going? But one very important detail that they look at, if the company or the JV, the third party, is below 700, is they look at the last seen date of the event, of that finding. Mm-hmm. So if they know that, okay, this detail or this issue has been fixed already, the last seen is more than a month ago, while they're just waiting for the ratings to come back up, they will leave the third party alone.
In tip 2, we'll talk about the ability to apply standard processes for vendor validation. When you onboard a new vendor, you have a number of due diligence steps you are likely to take action on. By using BitSight as a starting point in the cyber risk gathering process, you get a good starting point for these jobs. By providing suggested activities for each state of the lifecycle and providing a timer for each stage, you begin to build a standardized process for your vendor validation activities. Ensuring that you collect BitSight artifacts, tier the vendors appropriately, set alerts, and reach out every single time, you take many of the initial due diligence steps that will build a robust program into a process that can be managed long-term. One of these artifacts may actually include a historic report to build a past performance library of their cyber ratings over time. Next, you might use mapped assessments with questions like those pictured here, which you capture the rating details associated with each control question in your vendor assessment. This can later be compared to the assessment outputs you receive from your vendor via other tools or direct communications such as spreadsheets or shared documents.
Hey, hi, Serene and Dave. This is exciting, right? As we go into a new tip. So, in your experience, right, how do your customers standardize the process to monitor and validate their vendors? Maybe you can share some of the thoughts and maybe some of the experience shared by your customers.
Sure. Maybe I'll go first, David. Just because we are speaking to the Hong Kong audience, I think what is most relevant, of course, is the Hong Kong CIRA framework, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, specifically used on the financial sector. So there's this particular section that talks about third-party management, and it actually requires ongoing, I'm just reading off, ongoing monitoring of third-party risk. Now, I think that is something that is not widely adopted at this point, based on the conversations I've had. More and more organizations realize the importance of continuous monitoring. One-time yearly annual assessments on questionnaires is no longer enough. In order to adhere to the process of the authority, and of course to maintain that due diligence process, they have to now find a tool that allows them or complements the process of the questionnaire and allows them to have ongoing visibility of the risk posture of the third party. Does it make sense?
It does. And what's interesting on this topic is that, the very first step is always send out, the assessment you're doing.
Yes, exactly.
Standard assessment. And, obviously it's going to evolve into a continuous monitoring. But when you think about the assessment and understanding what parts can be monitored, it's sometimes difficult to put all those things together. So some of the ways that we look at it from a risk perspective is that you've got digital certificate data that we can actually look at, TLS certificates and also TLS configurations. And those things matter when you're talking about websites, for example, that are e-commerce websites that have an authentication mechanism. If the certificate behind that is not good, then you're going to end up in a situation where that certificate is potentially going to be in violation or causing you to communicate in a way that is not secure. Likewise, the configuration of those certificates may have something to do with the session encryption. So if the configuration doesn't have the right bit strength, it's probably not going to meet or comply with that standard that you have. So from a BitSight perspective, at the very beginning, as a standard process, you're going to do things like download a company report, just get an idea about that customer, have a past performance view this time last year of what that status was for the certificates and the configurations. And then later, you're going to translate that into a continuous monitoring alert. But in between, there's this part where BitSight is able to actually take the assessment framework, the questions, and put them into our portal and associate the appropriate risk vectors with each individual question. And at the time you send that assessment out, you can actually come gather that information out of BitSight and then have the status of that in your hands when you read those answers. So you can compare the answer provided in the attestation that's given to you from your vendor against what BitSight detected. Now, of course, we're only on the outside. One of the reasons continuous monitoring is so important is because nobody's going to hire an auditor to literally sit inside their network and just watch everything. It doesn't happen, right? So having continuous monitoring, I don't think any company, any customer listening today has an organization that wants to install a widget inside, no different than hiring an auditor, right? You don't want something sitting inside constantly tracking and tracing all of your stuff. But if you have something on the outside that can actually determine that the control exists and that there is some level of capability around the certificates or the encryption protocols used, anything like that, that's something at least you can get a sense of that throughout the year from an alert if something changes, things like that. And what's interesting about BitSight is that we have done a couple of studies in the past that compared external security posture against the internal security controls. And generally speaking, if an organization has a need for an encryption technology, it's not cheap to put in. And so nobody puts an encryption technology in and only puts it in on the inside and leaves the outside ugly. You know, if you think a limousine, you get into a limousine, you know, when you step up to a limousine and it's an expensive limousine, it's shiny and clean on the outside. If you open that door and look inside, you would expect it to be clean, right? It's not something different. So most organizations don't always credit the fact that what we see on the outside is actually likely to mirror a lot of what's going on inside. Not perfectly. Of course, there may be mitigating controls in between that nobody can see from the outside.
Yep.
But if you apply to encryption, identity and access management, file sharing, permission systems, access control, any of that on the inside, the odds are pretty good you're going to use the same technologies to manage the stuff sitting on the outside. So when you put that all together, it really gives you a way to get a snapshot of the actual external position or posture, and you can compare that against what they said when they sent you the attestation. And it gives you a nice comparison side by side. In tip 3, we're going to talk about the ability to continuously monitor a vendor. Continuous monitoring will allow you to track performance throughout the year so that if there is a precipitous drop in the ratings, you'll be alerted to the drop. If a drop occurs while you are monitoring, you can then just move the vendor over to the reassessment phase. The reassessment phase is in fact much the same as onboarding, with the exception of the fact that you move the vendor to a new tier or modify the alerting options based on the event. All of this is tracked inside the platform, but this is also sent along via emails. So for those of you with other tools like ServiceNow or some other GRC vendor risk management tool, alerts can be passed along there as well.
You know, David, I've been hearing a lot of customers share with me, one of the biggest challenges when it comes to continuous monitoring is the amount of alerts that they have to deal with versus the resources that they have. Mm-hmm. They definitely like the idea of continuous monitoring to be able to comfortably managing the risks that they might be getting from their vendors, right? Or exposed to their vendors. But with all of these alerts coming through from different systems, it can be very, very noisy in that sense. So in your experience, can you share a bit about how our customers have actually used the continuous monitoring function to eliminate this noise and make it more effective and productive for them?
Sure. So one of the things that comes into play when you use that tiering methodology we talked about before, where we set some thresholds on the tiers, instead of using things like a percentage change to trigger an alert, I lean towards using these thresholds because they're pretty hard thresholds and you can put them far enough apart that they're not going to be continuously double triggering because somebody dropped 100 or 200 points. So you can spread it out just a little bit so that you're not getting redundant alerts. And then second, we don't trigger off of percentages, which can get very noisy. So that's item one to help reduce the number of noise areas. The second one is that I like to make sure that we think about alerts and things like that, not only as strict alerts coming out in an email, but potentially just doing things in a report format. So we have a lot of the alert mechanisms, alert types that we have. You can actually run reports on them instead. And instead of having alerts coming out of the system and flowing out of the system, hitting an inbox and filling it up, you can actually just say, I'm going to run this specific report once a week or once a month or whatever, and use the trending of those changes in the risk vectors as your way of approaching it. And what's really nice about that is when you look at anything where you have performance over time, now you're going to see a story being told. So a line goes up, a line goes down. when you just have to understand, what does the line represent? So if it's bad records, you can see the line going up for bad records, and say that that line was really good in January. And I had maybe, I had a B in a specific risk vector. And then it goes up to an A in the next month. So that was nice. It's getting better. And then all of a sudden it drops to a C. And that's in March. So now you look back and go, well, what happened between February and March that caused such a variance? And you know, some of the stuff you're seeing on the outside, it's not always going to be as mission critical as some of the internal systems. So it's okay to look at it in that way. But by doing a trend line analysis instead of waiting on alerts continuously and using the trend lines as your method of continuously monitoring, you're still getting a look every single month at all of the different factors that change, and you're able to react to it at your own speed without feeling like you're getting slammed with thousands and thousands of alerts. In tip 4, we talk about how you can report on the progress of your program. Basically, the effective assurance element is going to allow you to improve your cyber assurance program through viewing vendor portfolio risk along with the progress of your lifecycle throughout each of these workflow-driven stages. You can report on many of the nuances of a company just by looking at their cyber rating, but you can actually look at things at the program level, which may be more useful. You can report the performance of your vendor portfolio, showing the risk improvements over time. In addition, you can report how the program objectives are being met, such as how long vendors have been sitting in each lifecycle stage during the process. These program level details should help you create performance objectives which you can manage the program by, and also help the team to identify what needs work. Finally, we'll talk about how you will have a documented program and to discuss how to identify processes, identify executive champions on your team, and when you'll be able to take action on integrating BitSight into your third-party risk management program. One of the key areas that you gain in this process is the ability to have a defined set of tasks which help you speed along the assessment and onboarding process. Through this process, you can reach out to vendors, ensuring that they're able to meet the security posture requirements that you set. And vendors can use this access to achieve those objectives by remediating the identified issues in their own view of the BitSight portal. From there, you then put them into a monitoring status that will let you either observe, remediate, or escalate into reassessment those vendors whose posture changes indicate that need. Finally, the reporting allows you to provide the information necessary for executives to make the appropriate risk-based decisions. So the 5 tips that we covered today included establishing an easy way to understand common metrics, standardizing the process for vendor validation, continuously monitoring cyber posture, reporting progress on your program, and documenting the program, finding a champion based on the organizations that you're using to complete this program, and then formalizing that program into a documented overall program that can be improved.
Hi, Serene and Dave. We get almost down to the last tip, I think, which is I think is the most important tip, right? We all agree that in any formal program, we need to know what is the risk appetite, the risk tolerance, the goal that you have set for the program, and also important, right, for everyone in the team to know what we're going to do at each stage, and how do you reassess, when do you reassess, and when do you escalate. So the question to both of you, right, is, do you spoke to customers, and I'm sure you have, right? And maybe you can share with us some of the best practice as they share the documentation process, and make sure that it's robust enough, that everyone is in the loop, everybody is communicated, everyone knows who is doing what. I think this is probably the final goal for a good formal program. What do you think?
I think this is the final goal, but also one of the most challenging. In fact, a lot of customers that I have come into contact with, they don't really have a formal process. They have a process, and they're always in the process, going through how can they fine tune, How can they formalize it? Exactly what David is mentioning. How do you document it, formalize it, and share it across different stakeholders? Mm-hmm. Primarily finance, legal, and InfoSec team, right? How do you make sure that everybody understand at which part do we trigger the reassessments? At which part do we trigger communication? How do we how do we go beyond the questionnaires? I think, David, this one, I really want to look to you for some advice for our customers and prospects. How can we build a more robust documentation that's sustainable across, no matter how many vendors or how few vendors they have?
Mm-hmm. So, as you know, BitSight's focus is not necessarily going to be to create documentation. However, what we have done is built into the platform a number of prescriptive processes that you can use. They don't have to be prescriptive, but the idea is that you have the ability to look at each individual stage of the life cycle. The very fact that we have 3 life cycles is in a sense, a form of documentation. It provides structure. And then in each one of those stages, we provide a number of actual tasks that you can use in order to accomplish the goal for that particular life cycle stage. And from there, whether or not you use the alerts during continuous monitoring or not, you actually still have a good understanding, even from a reporting perspective, of how long a vendor has sat in a given stage and whether or not a vendor, is having a major drop. So my trigger points when I think about it are going to be, if I see a drop of 50 to 100 points in a rating on any stage, I'm going to say, I probably want to take a look at that. If it turns out that it's, during the procurement process, they had a major drop and you're in the middle of an RFP or you're still writing a contract, if they have not yet done anything, that should be a prescriptive argument to say, I should ask the vendor, what just happened? How long ago did this happen? If a breach is reported and we pick it up and talk about it during the RFP or the contracting process, it probably happened a little while before, because we're reporting breaches that we actually are re-reporting from somebody else. There's no magical breach detection tool out there. We're reporting breaches we find. So you have the opportunity to, when you have leverage during a contracting process, is before you sign the contract. So by having that trigger that says something happened, gives you the ability to pause and say, wait, I need to know more. And right. Finally, I think just to wrap the whole thing up, it's good to know that each of these stages can be prescriptive as you like. And you can use what BitSight does through either the alerts, the tiers, or the lifecycle stages as a way to essentially provide a skeleton for your existing process. And if you're already working on documentation, use that as part of the documentation as a flow. And from there, it becomes a lot easier to move things through the process.
Right. This is great.
All right. Lastly, if you're interested, your account team here at BitSight has a third-party risk management evaluation capability built right into the BitSight platform that we can use to create a report on how your organization stacks up from a program perspective. If you're interested in any of that, please contact BitSight to discuss your TPRM program maturity and get some constructive feedback on forming or enhancing your program today. Thank you very much, and I look forward to speaking with you again in the future.
Okay, so David and Eric, I think this is really very, very valuable. It's a slightly different tune to the usual PowerPoint presentation, and I really like it. I like the interaction, and I hope the audience really benefit from our sharing. Me sharing more about the challenges and Dave providing more of the responses and answers from his experience. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, and I really appreciate it. Look forward to the next chance we get to talk.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.